You say the United States is not the main trading partner. South Africa exports huge quantities of products to the United States. If that line of business closes, can the European Union and China serve as alternative markets to the United States?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because that's sometimes the political talking point in South Africa, that some politicians will say, well, if the Americans don't want to import our products anymore, then we will simply export it to our friends in BRICS, to China and to Iran and Russia and maybe India and Brazil, countries like that, or the European Union. But this is a very important point because we have access to those markets on the same level as we have access to the American market. I can name several types of fruit that we can currently America, like avocados, forms of citrus fruits that we export to America, but that we can't at the moment export to countries like, for instance, India and China. And yes, so we import many products from China, but there are lots of difficulties for us and for our own producers, farmers, but also in big industries to export to China or to export to India or Russia or any of these countries. So it won't happen. It's not that simple. The same with Europe. There's a lot of import duties, a lot of protectionism in Europe. The European countries are protecting their own produce. The Spanish market, for example, prevent us in Europe from exporting certain products to European countries simply because those products are also produced in Spain. So that's a big problem in many of these countries. So the level of access that South Africa currently have to the American market is really unparalleled, in terms of our trading partners with other countries. So when you say that China is our biggest trading partner, it doesn't mean that we export so much to China. We rather import lots of products from China. We import most of our textiles and user products all from China. But our exports to China are very limited because they us from exporting products, for example, like vehicles, like motor cars, which we do export to America. We export several luxury motor cars to the American market, but we can't export that to China. There's very, very high import duties in the Chinese market.
The Beyond Africa podcast. Welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast. Jaco Kleynhans, you are welcome to Beyond Africa.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a privilege to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. As I told you, Beyond Africa is a podcast that is dedicated to shining a light on the African diaspora and also understanding what is happening on the continent, because the African diaspora plays a significant role in the development of the continent. But this cannot happen unless we understand what is happening on the continent. And I understand that recently you are a member of the Solidarity Movement in South Africa, and some other South African leaders like the Forum were visiting Washington, D.C. to advocate for South Africans and for a particular group of South Africans. What was that visit all about?
Yes, so we represent minorities in South Africa, minority groups in South Africa, and we are very concerned about two things, about South Africa's foreign policy. And the South African foreign policy at the moment is really alienating the American government, the Trump administration. So we are really afraid that we will probably lose access to the American market. We currently, as a country, has very favorable access to the American market. South Africa export about twice as much products to America that from what we import to from America. So we have a very favorable trade relationship with America, but I think that's under threat at the moment, and there's a few reasons for that. The South African government just become more and more anti-Western, anti-American in all their rhetoric. We saw just today that the South African ambassador in Washington called the American president, President Trump, a white supremacist, and that he's driving a white supremacist movement in America. Now, that kind of things, if an ambassador says something like that, then sadly enough, it will lead to further deterioration in the relationship between the two countries. So that's concerning to us. Also, the case against Israel, the South African government's decision to make a case against Israel. But then in terms of domestic policy, for us as minorities, we are very concerned about many different domestic policies in South Africa that really create very difficult situation for South Africans, but also causes many people to leave the country. And that's an African problem, you know. Many of our skilled people decide to immigrate and rather to go to countries where there are better opportunities for them.
Yeah, you are raising two concerns, domestic and international. But one of the consequences of your visit to Washington, D.C. has been an open call for South Africans, the Afrikaners, the minorities you're talking about, to immigrate to the United States and obtain the refugee status. So is it not contradicting what you are advocating for? You want to retain talent, but then your advocacy lets this open door for Africans, South Africans, to move over to the United States.
Yes, I think that was never our request also from the Trump administration, you know, so that's not for us, was never our priority, you know. We want our people to stay in South Africa, to create a future in South Africa, to have enough room in South Africa to really live and thrive here in this country. And we hope that we can get support from America and from the Trump administration to achieve exactly that, you know, to be able to create that kind of environment in South Africa where all people, all minorities in South Africa can thrive. So the decision by the Trump administration on the 7th of February, first to offer status to Afrikaners, you know, to come to America, and now more recently also to all farmers in South Africa, is not something that we've advocated for. You know, we haven't advocated with the Trump administration to do that.
Why would he give you what you did not advocate for?
Yes, I think there's two reasons for that. I think in the first place, the Trump administration are very sympathetic towards Afrikaners and minorities in South Africa. So I think that's a show of support in a sense. I remember that he offered this before we visited Washington. So I think that's very important. When we visited Washington, we had the opportunity to engage with the White House and the State Department and to tell them that this is not for us the first priority, you know. We're not in principle opposed to that, but that's not our first priority.
What is your first priority then?
Our first priority is support from America to create solutions in South Africa, you know. Our first priority is that we can still trade with America, because we as farmers, for example, need to trade with America, and that we believe that when the American government are angry at South Africa, that they must rather use other tools, tools that are available.
If you did not advocate to the American government, would the American government be intervening in South African affairs? Because when I read online, yes, it's AfriForum and Solidarity that caused the American government to interfere and propose solutions.
Yeah, that's absolutely not true, you know, and that was reported in so much media in South Africa, and it's unbelievable because we visited Washington after the Trump administration took these steps, and that was not in any way on any advocation from our side. You know, I was in America last year in November, and that was to discuss trade agreements, you know, with the American Congress. So we never advocated the Trump administration or anyone in the Trump administration about any steps that they need to take against South Africa. But it's very clear that over the last 3 years, there was a long process in America, in Washington, where especially the Congress and the House of Representatives started to take steps against South Africa. You know, there was laws written last year in February. There was a specific law that was accepted in the House of Representatives, voted on the relationship between South Africa and America. So this is an old process. What Trump did recently is not something new. It's not something that suddenly just happened after Trump was inaugurated. You know, there's been for the last 2 or 3 years, especially since the war.
Why did it become more prominent during the Trump mandate, especially the very first days? He's only 60 days in power, but he's taken about 2 or 3 critical decisions already about South Africa. Why now? Why didn't we see that under Joe Biden?
Yes, so it's interesting. Joe Biden was very sympathetic towards the ANC, the governing political party in South Africa. And that's a very old relationship. Joe Biden had a relationship with the ANC many decades back, so it's an old relationship. There was unhappiness in the Congress amongst Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and they wrote this law 2 years ago. They already started writing a law to ask for a review of the relationship between South Africa and America. But the White House said that they will not sign that law, So that was during the Biden administration, where you really had a very sympathetic White House towards not only South Africa. We want the White House to be sympathetic towards South Africa, but they were very sympathetic towards the ANC government.
So why should that be a problem? Because the ANC is in power and Biden was in power, so it should be government to government relationship. So why do you see that as a problem?
Yes, I think a few things have changed. We had an election last year in May, and the ANC lost the majority support. They went from 56% to 40%, so they're now a minority party. They govern with 9 other political parties in a government of national unity. And in that sense, policy in South Africa had to change after last year's election. And some policies changed, but the foreign policy of South Africa haven't changed. And I think that's a frustration, not only for us, but also for the American government. South African foreign policy towards Israel or towards Iran or towards the war in Ukraine, for example, that policy haven't changed. So the Americans thought that there will be a change in policy. That haven't happened. The ANC still dominate South African foreign policy. And I think that led to the Trump administration at the end of January saying, well, then they're going to review this relationship on their own.
So why is the South African relationship with the United States at this critical moment being driven by solidarity and AfriForum? Yeah. Why don't you let the South African government define the policy? Because the South African government brought the case against Israel at the ICJ. Why don't you let the South African government design the foreign policy and implement it?
Yes, well, that is what it is supposed to be, and it's supposed to be the government of national unity that need to do that. But the reality is that the relationship between the South African government and the American government is at an absolute low point. There were for nearly 2 years no ambassador, South African ambassador in Washington. Then there was a new ambassador recently appointed. He only arrived in Washington in the middle of January, and he's not well liked, especially with Republicans, because he's been very outspoken against Donald Trump, but also other Republican leaders. So from our side, we also say that yes, it's the South African government that is supposed to deal with foreign relations. But what our concern is that the relationship is deteriorating now so much that our members will pay a very, very deep price for this, especially if trade relations need to be affected in the next few months. We export more than 1,000 different products to America. If there must be import duties on South African products, then many people, we believe about 250,000 people will lose their jobs in South Africa. So that's our concern, and we went with our concern to America to lobby for the rights of our members.
Oh, so in this case, you lobby for the rights of your members, but you got a suspension or a freeze on foreign aid, and that affects not the government, because I always argue that freezes on foreign aid or sanctions on countries do not affect the governing class. They affect the people that are being governed. So that is what you achieved. But how...
That happened before our visit, so that was in the executive order of the 7th of February. That was 2 weeks before we visited Washington. We only decided to visit Washington after the executive order was signed. So the Trump administration made a decision to stop the humanitarian aid, to freeze that humanitarian aid to South Africa before our visit. And during our visit with the White House, we said to the Trump administration that we believe that that's not not the right avenue to freeze all humanitarian aid and to cancel trade relations, because exactly for that reason, you punish the normal South Africans, you punish poor people, people who need health care, people who are working as laborers in agriculture or in the steel manufacturing or car manufacturing industries, and you don't punish the political elite. The American government are angry at the political elite, but they're not doing anything to punish the American or the South African, the political elite, you know. So the steps that they took to freeze the humanitarian aid, we believe that that was not the right steps to take.
Okay, because I looked at your website and what I saw was a release of February 25, which says that according to Flip Buys, the chairperson of the Solidarity Movement, the South African government's lack of urgency to restore diplomatic relations with the USA is creating a growing crisis for South Africa. Yeah. And Boyce actually pointed out that the jobs of more than 500,000 workers with about 2 million dependents depend directly on South Africa's participation in the AGOA. Yes. So are you trying to ensure that there is no suspension of freeze or elimination of South Africa from the AGOA?
Absolutely. I think that's our first priority. You know, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, the AGOA Act, is for us very important because South Africa benefits the most out of that. Of the 32 African countries that benefit of AGOA, South Africa is by far the biggest beneficiary. There's about, like you've read there, about 250,000 jobs that can be lost if we don't have access to AGOA anymore. And I think that was our first priority with our visit to America. Not our only priority, but probably our most important priority. And for the simple reason that we believe that the South African government is doing nothing at the moment to try and solve that. And I think we've been successful so far, maybe only on a short term, but look at what the Trump administration did recently. They've implemented import duties on Canadian products, Mexican products, even products from the European Union and China, and there were no import duties so far implemented on South African products. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we've really asked the American government not to do that. Now, we can't ensure that that will still be the case in 6 months or a year's time, but we hope that it will at least buy us some time to try and fix this really bad relationship between the two countries.
Yeah, so what are you hoping now to happen? You just said the ambassador to the United States is considering Donald Trump as a white supremacist and is making very undiplomatic statements that could ruin the relationship between South Africa and the United States. Now, if President Trump decides to take an action that could impact the whole country, what kind of action do you see President Trump could take? Is it on the tariffs, or is that another action that he could take that could actually impact the people of South Africa?
Yeah, I think in the first place, what the Trump administration may do is that they may implement more political sanctions, sanctions against individuals, people in South Africa that were in the past involved in corruption, like with the Zondo Commission report that we had a few years ago on state capture, very high level corruption in South Africa. We know that the members of Congress are looking into that, and the White House are looking into that, so in that way send a warning shot towards the South African government to say, well, when there's people who are very corrupt in your government, then we will implement sanctions against them. So I think that's a very practical option that they are certainly exploring at the moment, the Americans, and that they are looking at. My fear is that if we don't solve the political relations between the two countries, that we can get to a point where there can be economic sanctions, not only AGOA. I mean, AGOA is very important, but you can have even much more severe economic sanctions where the Trump administration can implement import duties on all South African products, and even much further steps, that will make it really very difficult for South African businesses to do businesses with American companies. And what is important to understand is that our biggest foreign direct investments come from America. So America is not our biggest trading partner anymore. That is China and the European European Union, America is very important as a trading partner, but our biggest foreign direct investments come from the United States. And South Africa is very dependent on foreign investments. As a very open economy, our economy will have, well, it will have a very, very negative effect on our economy if there's further economic sanctions that will make it difficult for American companies to invest in the South African economy.
So you say the United States is not the main trading partner, but South Africa exports huge quantities of products to the United States. If that line of business closes, can the European Union and China serve as alternative markets to the United States?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because that's sometimes the political talking point in South Africa, that some politicians will say, well, if the Americans don't want to import our products anymore, then we will simply export it to our friends in BRICS, to China and to Iran and Russia and maybe India and Brazil and countries like that, or then even the European Union. But this is a very important point because we don't have access to those markets on the same level as we have access to the American market. I can name you several types of fruit that we can currently export to America, like avocados, some forms of citrus fruits that we export to America, but that we can't at the moment export to countries like, for instance, India and China. And yes, so we import many products from China, but there are lots of difficulties for us and for our own producers, farmers, but also in big industries to export to China or to export to India or Russia or any of these countries. So it won't happen. It's not that simple. The same with Europe. There's a lot of import duties, a lot of protectionism in Europe. The European countries are protecting their own produce. The Spanish market, for example, prevent us in Europe from exporting certain products to European countries simply because those products are also produced in Spain. So that's a big problem in many of these countries. So the level of access that South Africa currently have to the American market is really unparalleled, in terms of our trading partners with other countries. So when you say that China is our biggest trading partner, it doesn't mean that we export so much to China. We rather import lots of products from China. We import most of our textiles and user products all from China. But our exports to China are very limited because the Chinese prevent us from exporting products, for example, like vehicles, like motor cars, which we do export to America. We export several luxury motor cars to the American market, but we can't export that to China. There's very, very high import duties in the Chinese market.
I now understand why they talks about tariffs are causing a lot of problems because it depends on the market share. It depends on who is exporting to the United States and what the United States is exporting to that country. But on the flip side, how much quantities of goods does the United States export to South Africa? Is it significant?
No, it's not that significant, and I think that's one of the things that certainly creates unhappiness with American politicians, So we export about twice as much products to America than what we import from America. That is on a dollar term, in terms of dollars. And we have very high import duties on certain products. So the Americans want to export, for example, chicken and pork to South Africa, but there's a 75% import duty in South Africa for chicken from the US, and it makes it completely uncompatible. But we do import lots of chicken, but we do import that from countries in Southern America, for example. The same with motor cars, motor vehicles. So we export luxury motor vehicles to America, and it's mostly German companies who produce that motor vehicles in South Africa, export it to the American market. But we don't drive any American motor cars because we have a 40% import duty on American motor cars, so it makes it too expensive. And the Americans are very aware about that, So our market are, for many products, in a sense, closed to the Americans. But we want an open market in America. We want to export very easily to the Americans.
I was going to say you shouldn't say that loud because if President Trump hears that, he may want to impose some tariffs. With that said, your advocacy in this case is for the market, it's not for the Afrikaners. Am I getting that right?
Yeah. You're absolutely right, and I think that's a very important point, because that's something that many people also didn't understand. Maybe is that on this issue, we really lobby for all of South Africa. I mean, it's of the people who will lose their jobs if we are kicked out of the AGOA agreement, about 10% are Solidarity members. The other 90% are mostly black South Africans, mostly working class people from provinces like Gauteng and the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. That's where most of these jobs are. So we advocate in that sense for all of South Africa, And what we've just said in the beginning of February is we cannot let this just lie around this issue. We can't wait for the South African government to hopefully at one point start to do something about this. We will need to step in. We do have very good contacts in the American government, at the American Congress, something that I've worked on for many, many years, and we now make use of our contacts to try and lobby the current American government on these issues.
All right, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about Africa. How would this advocacy help the rest of Africa, not only South Africa, but the rest of Africa? Do you see any prospects of the other African countries benefiting from this advocacy?
Yeah, that's also very important, because AGOA at the end of the day is an act for Africa. It's sub-Saharan African countries that benefit from AGOA, currently 32 countries. And it's very important for all these countries that AGOA must be kept in place. So the current AGOA Act will run till the end of August this year, and then in September, end of September, then there's a new act that will be voted on in the American Congress. So it's for most African countries very important. For our own neighboring countries in Southern Africa, countries like Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, it's very important for them also, because all those economies benefit from South African exports to America. So we will see, for example, that you will have certain agricultural products produced in Namibia, but exported from South Africa with South African exporters to the American market. So if South Africa loses access to the American market, you will also have job losses in Namibia. And maybe in Botswana the same, and even in Angola. So the economies in Southern Africa are very much linked with each other. If you look at Eastern Africa, it's very much different. There are countries in East Africa that really currently benefit from AGOA. A country like Kenya last year had a 10% increase in their exports to America. That was very beneficial to the Kenyan economy, and that was because they simply produce specific products for the economy in America. So I think the Eastern African countries will certainly benefit from the extension of the current AGOA Act.
Yeah, when you make this argument, it sounds very economic, very market-driven to my ears, and maybe to the audience. But when you used terms like minorities in the advocacy, or when President Trump used minorities, it sounded more political than economic. And most people will resonate more with the economic argument rather than with the political argument. Maybe it is because of the political connotation that pushed people to think about the Afrikaners begging President Trump to intervene in South African affairs. Was it necessary to couch this as a minorities problem?
Well, the economic challenge is not a minority problem, So that's a problem for all of South Africa. I think that's a fact.
I do get that. My problem is President Trump in his truth post actually mentioned minorities, and on the release I'm reading on your website, you actually mentioned minorities also. So I am wondering when you put minorities side by side the economic argument, it kind of defeats the purpose of the economic argument.
Yeah, I think that's a completely different issue. So the minority issue is not an economic issue, So it's not an economic issue when we talk about trade with America. or anything like that, or access to humanitarian aid. That's not an issue for minorities in South Africa. But what is very clear to us is that the Trump administration are very much aware about discrimination against minorities, and Trump has been outspoken about that, So we also engaged with the Trump administration in Washington on issues that affect minorities in South Africa, specific discriminatory acts in South Africa against minorities, issues that affect minorities, that we believe are at this stage not beneficial to South Africa, but certainly one of the reasons why so many people from minority communities in South Africa immigrate. Afrikaners, people of Asian descent, the so-called colored community in especially the Western Cape. Many people decide to leave South Africa and to immigrate because of discriminatory policy by the government. But that's a very political issue, So we always say we need to split the political issues from the economic issues. Sometimes they do influence each other, but on trade policy, that's simply an economic issue. But Trump are very much focused also, and that was clear during our visit to Washington, on the issues of domestic policy, issues like land expropriation, issues like racial discrimination in South Africa, access to schools, access to education in mother tongue own languages, all those issues. The Trump administration are very much aware also of those issues.
Yeah, let's look at the Land Expropriation Act. Why is it so contentious?
Yes. So I think we must go back to 2018 because that's very important to understand the history. In 2018, February 2018, there was a motion in the South African Parliament that asked that the South African Constitution need to be changed so that land can be expropriated without any compensation. So they wanted to change the South African Constitution. We were very strongly opposed to that, So then there was a whole process for 2 or 3 years on to change the South African Constitution, and at the end there was not a 2/3 majority in the South African Parliament. So they voted in Parliament, it was defeated, the change of the Constitution, and then the ANC government at that point said that, well, if we can't achieve that, we can't change the Constitution, then we're just going to write a new act, because with a new act you only need 50% plus one votes in Parliament. So they wrote a new Expropriation Act. And it's a very broad act, and for many issues in the act we can agree with. There's many things in this act that's very normal, that are normal in most countries in the world, where you need to build a new road or a new railway and you need to expropriate land and you need to give compensation for that. That's part of this act. But then there's a part of this act that says that a court can decide that certain lands can be expropriated with zero compensation, without any compensation. And that takes us back to where we were in 2018, with the decision on changing the Constitution. And we say that we are opposed to any expropriations where there's no compensation, where there's absolutely zero compensation. We believe that is that's really problematic, and it takes us back to a point where we believe we're not supposed to be.
Yes, I'm looking at the Expropriation Act, and it says that's Section 12, subsection 3. It says it may be just and equitable for zero compensation. So, but if the courts could find that it could be just and equitable, and then they decide not to give compensation, do you have a problem with letting off go with just and equitable?
Well, yes. So our worry is simply in terms of who will decide what is just, and what is.
But the courts will decide.
Yes, but that's worrying, If you look at certain decisions made by courts in South Africa, even the highest court, the Constitutional Court, on things like mineral rights, water rights, other issues like that, that we believe that this act is not specific enough. We believe that this act is weak. And they were very good, and that I think that's one of the reasons why there's so many court cases now against this act. So the president signed this act, this expropriation Expropriation Act, while there were very good legal arguments made to the president to say that the act needs to be more specific, the act needs to be clearer in certain terms, and that came from many places. It's not only from us. So it were from many organizations in South Africa who said that you need to refer this act back to Parliament and to refine certain issues within the act. And I think at the end we will see what happened now in courts, but there's several court cases against this act, and it will probably go all the way to the Constitutional Court.
Okay, I would like to have a deeper conversation on the legal aspects of this in the future, but there are arguments that the Afrikaners just came to South Africa and they shouldn't own land over indigenous South Africans. What says you?
Yes, I mean, Afrikaners, people need to understand Afrikaners, and I think there's been so much political propaganda and things against Afrikaners, but Afrikaners are very much committed to South Africa. I think that's the first thing to say. Afrikaners have been in South Africa for 350 years. Our identity is a South African identity. It's an African identity. We refer to ourselves as Africans because we don't feel at home in Europe. We're not Europeans, we don't speak a European language. We don't understand European languages, not even Dutch properly, a little of Dutch, but not much of Dutch, We feel very much at home in terms of we are at home in South Africa, we're at home in Africa. And that is why you will find Afrikaners in every African country. There's Afrikaners doing business, farming, working in countries from Zambia to even in North Africa and Eastern African countries. So Afrikaners are very much involved and committed to Africa, doing business in Africa. And I think that is something that is, in a sense, for me, sad with our recent visit to Washington, the idea that we are unpatriotic, that we may be unpatriotic towards South Africa or anything like that, And while we're also, and we've been honest with the Trump administration also, that we do believe that Afrikaners will not, in large numbers, immigrate to America. There may be some people that are very poor, people who've lost everything, who went through maybe trauma or whatever, and they will take up this opportunity. And that's individuals. People always move around. But the vast majority of Afrikaners will not leave South Africa to go to America. They are very much committed to South Africa. They love South Africa, and they want to find at the end solutions for the broader South African challenges,
But on the land question, historically, during the apartheid regime, land was mostly owned by the whites, as I hear. I don't have any data to back that. But then now the blacks are saying they also want part of that land. So it's a question that must have driven the legal amendments to come up with this expropriation act we're talking about. So where do you situate the black request for land and then the Afrikaners' current ownership of the land? What mechanisms do you put there?
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that that we're not opposed to land restitution in any sense, in the sense that there must be more black farmers, commercial farmers in South Africa, and specifically commercial farmers. I mean, there's many black subsistence farmers in South Africa, but we believe that there must be more black commercial farmers, and our own organization work with many black communities in the Eastern Free State, in the Eastern Cape. There's even a project in Limpopo where we found the finance for those projects. Our problem is the way that it was dealt with in the last 30 years. So there's no shortage of land. I think that's very important. And the numbers that some people use, even some people in the government, are completely wrong. That they will say that 70% or 80% of land belong to white farmers or to Afrikaner farmers. That's absolutely not true. That's not the case. That is of current commercial active farms, but more than 30% of agricultural land in South Africa, about a third of agricultural land, belongs to the government. And that's the problem. So there's been many projects in the last 30 years to buy farms from white farmers and to try and give that land to black farmers. But there were never examples where people were given the ownership of that land, black farmers the ownership, and you can't successfully farm or work on a farm, successfully create a commercial farm if you don't have ownership of land, because then you don't have ownership to capital. And that is one of the big things that we believe went wrong over the last 30 years. So there's lots of of land, more than enough land left. To give you an idea, all the land during apartheid that were part of the old areas where the apartheid government wanted black people to live, and there's huge parts of land. I mean, I talk of huge parts of the Eastern Cape, of KwaZulu-Natal, parts of the Limpopo province. That land today still all belong to the government. So it belonged to the white apartheid government before 1994, and today it belongs to the South African government. We believe that black people need to get the ownership of that land. You cannot be a commercial farmer if you don't have ownership. If we can use all the available land, and black people can farm all that commercial land, just think of the potential in South Africa. But I've been to many of those places. You can drive for hundreds of kilometers through certain areas of the Eastern Cape in South Africa, and there's absolutely no farming, no commercial farming going on that land, because it belongs to the government and it's completely unused.
So why do you think the government want to take land, want to expropriate land, and give it to black South Africans? Meanwhile, they have land that they are not using.
Yeah, I think it simply became a political issue. You know, we have a government in South Africa that are losing support. There are very, very, very serious issues in South Africa. There's extreme poverty, extreme unemployment. The unemployment amongst black South Africans increased by 100% in the last 20 years. In 2 decades, it doubled the number of unemployed black South Africans. So the level of unemployment and poverty is at an extreme level. Less and less people are voting for the ANC political party in South Africa, and land and white land ownership became a political issue. It became like in our neighboring country, Zimbabwe. It became something to politicize, to be populist. It's a very populist kind of political issue that are used in elections against the minority. And to be honest with you, you know, if you talk to most black South Africans, their first priority are not to get access to a farm or to try and be a commercial farmer. Black South Africans want access to good education for their children, good housing, good jobs opportunities, mostly in urban areas, because there were quite an urbanization in South Africa over the last 30 years. So it's not the first priority of most black South Africans to become commercial farmers. People have very specific priorities, and they're very concerned about education, healthcare, the crime situation, the unemployment rate, the state of infrastructure in South Africa, the fact that the economy is not growing, that there's not job creation. That are the real concerns for most South Africans, and especially for black South Africans.
But why do we hear about the land problem more than any other problems?
Simply because we believe that the government have failed. They failed to fix the education system. They failed to create an environment for job creation. They failed in terms of crime, where crime is out of control in South Africa. We are one of the most dangerous countries in the world. They failed to fix healthcare. So government-run hospitals are in a terrible state in South Africa. They failed to create housing solutions for people in urban areas. So now they need to find a scapegoat. They need to find a scapegoat, a political scapegoat, and they're using the fact that white people are own farms and are very successful as farmers and very successful farmers. They use that as a scapegoat to say that all the problems in South Africa, all the fact that everything is failing in South Africa, we need to blame that on white people, and they make it a very racialized issue. So it becomes a white against black issue. Then you know that it's white people who wants to control the economy, who don't want to give access to the economy to black South Africans. And when you look at land, that's simply not the issue. By far, the biggest owner of land in South Africa is the government. They own some of the best agricultural land that's available in this country.
Yeah, let's round up with this last question. You're talking about the white people controlling the economy, but is that not true? Doesn't the white race in South Africa control the economy?
I don't think so, you know. I mean, we've had policies like affirmative action and black economic empowerment in South Africa now for 25 years, more than 25 years, 27, 28 years. I think the problem in South Africa is that we have a serious problem in terms of education. I think the fact that the education and our schools are in such a terrible state at the moment that many of the schools, especially in poor black communities, are worse than what it was 10, 15 or 20 years ago. I think that's our biggest problem. If people don't have access to good education, then there's really not hope, then there's really not opportunities to become part of an economy in South Africa. So we need to fix that basic things, to give black people really more opportunities in South Africa. It's not about who control the economy, because the economy is an open economy. South Africa's economy is very much open, and where black people get access to the economy through good education opportunities, they succeed very well, and there's so many examples of that. But my concern is really, and from our side, is that the vast majority, I would say about 80% of black children in South Africa don't have access to good education. That's a fact.
Does the black immigrant population in South Africa succeed in the economics dispensation in South Africa?
Yes, they mostly succeed better than South African, black South Africans, and for the reason that they usually come from countries where the education system are better. So in many African countries, they are much better at education, despite the fact that those countries are much poorer than South Africa. So you will find more and more very successful black doctors, medical specialists in South Africa. And then when I will talk to someone like that, I will ask, but I don't understand your accent. Where do you come from? You don't sound South African. I recently met a very good heart specialist who comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I mean, that's a very poor country, but there's a very good heart specialist operating on people in private hospitals in South Africa, but he's from the DRC. And it's because there's in many countries simply better education. So you will have many people, black people from other African countries being very successful in South Africa. Also at our universities, I've recently met so many black academics at the University of Pretoria, and most of them come from other African countries.
Yeah, I got my doctorate from the University of the Free State, and many Cameroonians are in the University of the Free State, and it's doing so well. But the argument that the educational system in South Africa is worse off than in some African countries is questionable and arguable. We can talk about that later on, but it could be at different levels. But at the university level where I studied, there are completely different levels. South Africa is on par with other countries. I've studied in China, I've studied in the United States, and I've studied in South Africa. So I know I could compare this, but this is at the tertiary level. Anyway, thank you so much for coming to Beyond Africa podcast, Jaco Kleynhans. I would like to have you again for another conversation. We need to talk about the Black empowerment programs. We need to talk about the educational system in South Africa. We need to talk about governance between 1994 and today to see the progress that's made. If you have any last words, I would like to hear them.
Yes, I think what is important is that, and I always say that to people, that Africa and the African continent will be the continent of the greatest potential in the next 10 or 20 years in the world. Africa is a young continent. Demographically, it is the continent best positioned to create economic opportunities in the future. So we need to just get our houses in order, We need to get policy right in most African countries, and that's the same for South Africa. South Africa is a country of great potential. We can have a very, very successful economy. We can fix the problems in our country, but we need to get basic policies. If we can get those policies right, then we can fix these issues.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for coming to the program. I am definitely going to be inviting you again, and I suppose many people will enjoy this conversation and they will learn a lot, especially on the part where Solidarity and AfriForum are insisting on market deals between the United States and South Africa and not on the political arguments, because we need those economic, trade, and investment deals to transform the continent of Africa. The African diaspora needs to think about that orientation and adopt such lines towards the development of Africa. And we want South Africa to stand strong. We want South Africa to develop. We want South Africa to pull the rest of Africa towards development, because we consider South Africa as the leader in development in Africa, and we cannot afford to see South Africa go down at any cost. Thank you again for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you.